Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm Claire. I know lots of you. I don't know some of you, so especially the people that I've never met. Thank you very much for answering our invitation to come and join us for some of these conversations. For me, all I really need to say to open this discussion is that the series is extremely important in terms of the work that I've been doing for the last 2 years. So my background's in Extinction Rebellion. That's where I started really kind of pushing for deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies. And I think, having a bubbling movement, and lots of you here are from the sort of grassroots and self-organized democracy space, which is really exciting. I've found over the years that there's tons of interesting challenges and questions about how to get people to carve out space for themselves in democratic participation, and also how experts do that with often institutional backing and big budgets and people with PhDs and all the rest of it. And so the first one in the series was really asking about how these kind of different ways of working could coexist and perhaps both contribute at the same time, or multiply contribute to an enhanced or a reimagined, reinvigorated democratic sort of fabric or landscape. And it's a very strange day today to be having an online call about creating more democracy, obviously. So I hope you're all right as well, because I cried a lot this morning when I started to see the news coming in from over the water. What I hope is that this whole series, looking at these different questions, is going to help us to present some easily digestible information and highlights, I guess, on the critical kind of challenges and questions that we focused on. It won't be the whole story, but I hope it's a useful sort of beginning of looking at some of these challenges and questions in a constructive way that can help us all to move forwards. And also what's been clear over the last few sessions that we've done, which has done the thing I hoped it would do, which is great, is to bring together the people from the movements and the people from the grassroots with the people from the sort of institutions or the professional delivery experts or whatever, and to build bridges between those spaces where actually we don't often get to spend very much time together. And I'm really delighted that there's lots of people who seem to think that's a good thing to do, and that they're glad that it's having that impact. So hopefully this is more of that too, which is great. I will pass back to you, David. I think that's all I need to say.
Great. Thank you, Claire. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much from me too for coming along. Of course, many of you are deeply experienced in doing participative events like this. And there's a variety of styles and values that people are bringing today. We will be trying to embody citizen participation in how we run today, but of course we're not perfect. So I hope you will give us permission for making mistakes. What I want to do now is just cover the ground rules and our agenda. So basically we have 2 ground rules for our time together: respect and confidentiality. So on respect, we ask that everyone treats each other with respect as a default, and that includes respecting different views and respecting people's time. So please keep your points pithy and concise if you possibly can. I will do my best for us to end at 8:30, which is our end time. And then the other thing about confidentiality, we are recording these. If there's anything that you say that you don't want to be going into a public domain, please let us know, but we are hoping to be able to put these out in a way that will be useful to others over time. So our flow for today is as follows. So in a moment, we'll break into small groups of 3 to have a little bit of introductions. It's unfortunately too big a group for everyone to introduce themselves to everybody else, but we want to do a little bit of bridging introductions so that you have a sense of who else is in the room. And we have a question for our session today, and Rich is the question holder. So we'll give him at most 5 minutes to unpack the question about who sets the agenda and how does asking the question set the frame for assemblies. And then we're going to have a good chunk of time for people to share their own stories of their own experiences and the lessons that come from those stories. I can't guarantee that everyone will be able to share a story, or we'll do our best. This is why it's great if you're concise. Then that gives more space to other people to share their stories. We'll then ask Claire to articulate the themes that she's heard so far, and then we'll have a sort of building on those themes, a response to those themes, other things that people have heard. And then finally, we'll close out with a thanks and next steps, and do that by 8:30. And you'll notice that there are some people who are observing. Either they've not put on their cameras, or they're looking suitably creative in the corner. So one of the things we're trying to do as part of this project is not just produce like a PDF that sits on a dusty folder somewhere, but actually creates outputs which engage people and are more creative. So we've got some people who are observing, and out of earlier sessions, we've had things like poems, and we've had things like illustrations, and hopefully these things will also come through over time and bring all of what we're talking about alive. So without further ado, I want to ask Alex to put us into the bridging introductions, and the instruction here is about helping you to see who else is in the room. We'll have 3 of you in each little small group. And we're going to give you 1 minute each to say what brought you to this call. So what's your connection to this call? And with that, Alex, could you send us off to get to know each other? Hi, Alex. I know that my group really wanted to use every last second, so I think that might be what other people are up to as well.
We got sick of each other.
Well, you know.
No, not really. I'm joking.
And I'm not one to judge on this.
I love that. Love that about you, David.
Whereabouts are you calling in from, Pete?
Kendall.
I see. Cool. I can't help. Do I always make the same joke about mint cake at this point?
Yeah, go for it.
Probably. Excellent. Okay.
Oh.
So when I was just trying to wonder where's Claire, but I didn't spot you, Claire, because you've got your mug. So anyway, regardless, now we're all back. There she is. We've had our little introductions. I'm sure that 1 minute each was not enough, and you're just what's the right word for it? Curious on everybody else. But I think it's now time to move into exploring this question about who sets the agenda. And the person who is our question holder for the evening is Rich Wilson. Rich, I'll hand over to you now for 5 minutes. You might want to give a little flavour of your experience as well, just so everyone knows who you are, for those who don't. But 5 minutes, please, on this question and why you think it's so important.
Thanks so much, David and Claire. Alex, great to be here. For those, I know an awful lot of you on the call, but for those who haven't met me, I put some articles in the chat to kind of have a look at that. But I've been working on stuff for quite a long time. I founded an organisation called Involved 20 years ago. I wrote a kind of review of the last kind of 20 years of democratic innovation, and for that, so it's just in there in case that's interesting. So yeah, so what I'm really aware of in this particular group is there are a lot of people who've got a lot more experience than me in different parts of this. I think just zooming out, when we're thinking about agenda setting, so my understanding of the purpose of these calls is to provide a learning resource, particularly for people, grassroots organisers of grassroots-led citizens' assemblies. So I just think that's a really important frame of who we're trying to speak to, because of course, who is running a citizens' assembly really, really matters in terms of this issue of who asks the question and sets the frame, etc. And I think there's a couple of other dimensions that really matters. One is that we are kind of moving from one-off projects to permanent infrastructure. And secondly, is that we're trying to build governance infrastructure which enables us to meet the crisis and build solidarity. So that's at least the starting assumptions that I have. And that's really important, because if you're setting a one-off project to the deliberative process, that would be completely different from if you're setting off a permanent infrastructure body, etc. So I think, I mean, clearly, there's a lot of power in who sets the question, and we are all, we're all constrained by the cultural conditions we live in. So, for example, people will often complain that climate assemblies are failing to challenge systemic issues of growth, for example. This is a classic critique of how climate assemblies are framed. And indeed, and those of us who are like within those cultures, you could say that there's always limits and constraints within how we frame a question based upon our cultural conditioning. I don't think it's worth sort of saying that really, really clearly. And so I just wanted to mention kind of what's for me felt like three types of agenda setting processes that I'm aware of: kind of institution setting, stakeholder setting, and bottom-up participant-led setting. And so a classic institution setting, and I've been involved with lots of these, is when a government sets the agenda. So it will set the framing question. You know, we want to try and achieve net zero by 2040 in a fair and effective way, that kind of thing. And a government might set that kind of agenda. That's actually a very similar framing question to what came out of the stakeholder-led process that I know Justin knows a lot more than I do within the Scottish Climate Assembly, and also the Armenian Permanent Assembly that was set up a couple of years ago by us also had a stakeholder-led process whereby stakeholders came together and can answer that question. And then what's emerging now around the world are these people's assemblies, citizens' assemblies, where citizens themselves are determining and setting the agenda. And what I've been noticing when I've been talking to some of these groups is how often people ask, do I have legitimacy to set a question? And often my response to them is, well, if you're living in a place and you've got children in a place and this is where you live, then you've got as much legitimacy as anyone else, provided you're transparent and open about your motivations to do that. And this is my general sense of that, is that provided we are transparent and open and seeking to be conscious of the power we hold when we set a question and ask a question and are prepared to be challenged on that. And I think particularly as we're moving to the space of setting up these local permanent citizens' assemblies to help navigate the poly crisis, in a sense, what matters most, my sense is that we are incredibly transparent about that intention, incredibly clear about where the roots are that have come from that. It might just be there's been three of us that have met in a pub and we want to kind of decide how we're going to manage our park. But provided we're clear and transparent and tell that story and it's open to challenge, then in many ways we're bringing the community together on that journey. I think when these things are hidden and people are pretending one thing is about something, but it's actually about something else, and that's when we're in problem. Obviously, the classic problem in an agenda setting process is when you get it particularly in the institution-led processes when they say we're going to give you power over something, we're going to invite you in to shape national policy. But we've seen this a lot in the UK over the last kind of 10 years. And in fact, you had a government in place that is completely incapable of listening and indeed often has a position of not wanting to listen to people. And those processes, you'd have to say, are on the verge of being manipulative. And the agenda not only is being kind of set by civil servants with a very, very constrained sense of what's possible, but it's deeply disingenuous that they're ever going to be able to influence something. Very, very different, for example, in the French climate process, which has now had 54% of the recommendations implemented, but largely because of the mass social movement that was around it, as opposed to necessarily the commitment from government. That's me.
Great, thank you, Rich. So in terms of this question about who sets the agenda, who does asking the questions, and how does asking the questions set the frame for assemblies, your crucial point is about the transparency of intention, the transparency of history that's got you to that point of asking that question. And that's our starting point. Yes,
and I think being aware of these different ways that it could be done. That are top down, there is bottom up, there are mixed ways, there are others as well. But I think being, the more we can become conscious of the options and the pros and cons of each, the better.
Great, thank you. So now we turn over to everybody else and ask for your stories. So what I want to do is just ask people to put up their hand. Iago is ahead of me on this. This is fantastic. He'll be first. We'll ask people to put up their hands and tell their stories. If possible, I'd like people to be, if you like, building on or responding to the past story, but sometimes that won't be possible. And given that we're all on Zoom, seeing who's most sort of interested in responding to a particular point is going to be a little bit difficult, but we'll have to go where we are. So, Iago, can you give us a little story of your own experience here, which sort of speaks to this question?
Yes, Thank you, and I'm sorry about being a little bit pushy with my hand, but I need to, I'm traveling, so I will need to continue the conversation with my phone, but I will continue the discussion. But I think it's better if here that I'm in the hotel, I can make the pitch. So yes, I think we have two very interesting experiences that are quite really connected, because obviously we have experience helping institutions to frame the issue. That is one of the basic, the mainstream way of setting the issue in the deliberative process. Is like with you sit with the government and you help them to frame the issue. If you're lucky, you can push the government a little bit and they will bring some stakeholders, and you will have like a more balanced group that will help you to set the framing, but this is not usually the case. But we have been trying to be ambitious, and we had the chance here in Barcelona with the city council to commission with them a process, a 100 assembly process. And it was the first two sessions were just dedicated to set the agenda. So basically, we follow a completely blank page process. It was a very basic question regarding which is your project of life, so something very wide open. And then they start to fulfill ideas from a blank page. And basically, we conduct a process with, brainstorming ideas, clustering ideas, titling clusters, prioritizing clusters. And once we have this kind of prioritization of clusters, we help them to create questions. And basically, the inertia coming from this process is that those questions express desires. They express desires, for example, how far the youth in Barcelona could have an affordable housing at 20 years old, 25 years old, something like that. So they express desires and how the city council can help them. So I think that is quite interesting. And also we conduct a parallel process with the World Citizen Assembly Lab. That is, this is an online laboratory of multilingual deliberation. So we conduct single room deliberation online with different people. And we will be conducting more or less the similar process. So with volunteers, that will be like the self-selected, more or less, and also with 4 persons that acted as a control room, and those persons were low income from Africa, India, Latin America, and we contrast the kind of topics that were emerging. And the bad news for the climate aware people is that climate goes down when you get the low income, and thriving topics become top. So this is a very interesting outcome from the process. Basically, our conclusion is that citizens will not be enough to create impact framings. So impact framings for us are framings that are appointing as a very impactful area and a policy dilemma. So what happened is that citizens, everyday citizens, tend to focus on expressing desires, and this is easy for them. But when they need to identify the impact area on the topic, like to solve that desire, they struggle to do that. So they will need the help of stakeholders and experts, and it should be a balanced panel of stakeholders and experts who can help them identify impact areas and policy dilemmas. And that's my story. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So citizens, you had a process for them discovering their own questions together, and your experience is that those citizens, when they do that, they tend to express their desires. I was slightly trying to figure out what the word you were using, but it's desires. And then, but when it comes to having more pointed questions, which are more likely to have impact, your experience is that experts are better at drawing those together, and perhaps there's a way of doing that in combination with citizens.
Yeah, the problem with the framing based on desires is that the deliberation could just be driven to creating wish lists and not really focus on why the problem is complex and where the different stakeholders disagree. That is the hot areas for deliberation.
Great,
yes.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And I was going to ask for the next story, which may or may not be a response to that one. And Justin has put their hand up. So Justin, over to you.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you very much. I definitely feel unless people are given different analysis, then it's very hard to move forward. But when given a really solid analysis and a variety of them, a range of them, then people can really think through the solution. So I have a slightly different experience, I guess, to that. But I want to come back to Richard's point about that we've all got agendas, and that being transparent and open about them is absolutely fundamental. But also, who's funding us to do a particular assembly? Where's that coming from? So, for example, with Eva, I've been working on assembly process in Torry in Aberdeen, where the kind of life expectancy is 30 for men is 13 years lower than people in nearby areas. So it's a very poor area. What surfaces is obviously immediate issues, as Iago was mentioning. What surfaces are immediate needs, immediate issues that hit you. But it's tying those together and finding out how they connect. Then you can go to a much deeper place. And I guess I just want to just look at this particular assembly at Torry, but then also the climate assembly, that Scottish Climate Assembly that I was involved in, that Rich mentioned earlier. So at Torry, what we were doing was asking people. So we had a whole engaged listening process on the streets, in pubs, in golf clubs, wherever, talking with people to find out what issues mattered to them. And then coming together, a kind of steering group coming together and mapping out the different issues. And they were around powerlessness. They were around about places being taken away. They were around about ill health and so on. And from that, then developing a question as a group from people there in terms of what the issues were that mattered to them. But then when it came to the assembly itself, the Scottish Government had decided 2 weeks before that they wanted to destroy the last green remaining space in this particular community. So suddenly that question kind of went out the window, and in came the major issue that drew people to the assembly and the passion in the assembly. But then after the assembly, though the focus was then on how do we save the park, after the assembly, the kind of work that's been done has been much more holistic in the sense of addressing a much larger issue, into looking at retrofit, looking at how to address ill health and address poverty and so on, and all those issues in that way. So I just want to bring in the notion that, and we were being funded by the Just Transition Commission in Scotland, so we were being funded from the government, and Aberdeen Council was keen on this, and they were very keen on this, particularly if it didn't end up with something that would confront them. And it did end up with something confronting them, because the Assembly was very strong on trying to stop the park being taken away. And the leader of the council and others were very upset by the Assembly arriving at that conclusion. So I think it's fine to be transparent about where your funds come from. It's very good to be transparent about your agenda, but it's really important to be welcoming of the agendas of the people there, and also to not be giving into power when actually the decisions of people there go against power. But what I really want to talk about, just very briefly, is the Scottish Climate Assembly. And in that, the way that we got to the question, the civil servants wanted a very mediocre question, which saw climate change as something out there and Scotland over here. And those of us from Exeter who were on the stewarding group, there were 2 of us, and then 25 other people who were kind of handpicked by either politicians or civil servants. So we were quite in a minority in terms of our relationship to those in the status quo. But nevertheless, because we were on Zoom or the equivalent, because COVID had just hit, it was one of those meetings where you could talk to people one-to-one. So like I could do this just now with you. And so at the end of a particular session, people all agreed to having a process whereby the question would be decided by the stewarding group as a whole, rather than us just taking the question from the civil servants. And what was interesting in that process of designing the way of choosing assembly was that even though I was in with a Tory member of the parliament who I don't particularly agree with politically, even though I was in small groups in that with people who I disagree with, actually where people went to was very much the same place, of somewhat quite a deep place of really considering the issue. And that was because you had Kevin Anderson, who I'm sure most of you know, scientist who speaks very, very clearly about the climate crisis. And then you had somebody speaking from a much more status quo position. And when you put them next to each other, it's kind of obvious what kind of crisis we're in. And we had Becky Willis speaking very realistically about the limitations of climate assemblies. And we had Claire Miller speaking about the French Assembly and what was possible there. And people again arrived at quite an ambitious notion of what could be achieved. So the question that we arrived at was very, very much stronger than the one that civil servants wanted. But last point, the framing of the whole assembly, the holding of it, was by civil servants. So you can get a great question, you can get a great framing at the start, but if it's controlled by those who are wedded by definition, because of their jobs, to the status quo and to not threatening the status quo, then you'll get nowhere. So there's something about the power on the streets that needs to accompany democratic processes. We shouldn't think of them as hived off specialist things that happen over there in a technical way. They need to be utterly connected to passion on the streets, so they won't work.
Great. Thank you very much, Justin. There's a lot to unpack from that, so I'm not going to try to summarize it, particularly as Marit put their hand up halfway through and Justin was in the first part of his stories there. So Marit, what would you like to share with us?
Thank you. Yeah, it's in response to the previous 3 speakers, really. So one concern I always have when it comes to, for example, being conscious and transparent about what drives your agenda is the limitations we have ourselves in terms of being able to be conscious of that. And I was trying to think about how to frame that as a story, because I'm not a practitioner. I only have so many stories from practice. But I guess for me, you know, there's been some instances or some examples of where I've really understood something new about the world that I hadn't before, that's then really life-changing, right? I'm sure all of us would have examples like that. And for me, it often came from reading a really good article And an example by way of a story is, I guess, when I was still a master student and I read this piece by ISWE Mert from Stockholm University, who wrote that on sustainable development, that we need to understand that in the context of the previous discourse around limits to growth and the previous focus in the United Nations on environmental questions, and when it came to sustainable development as the new focus in the 1980s, the word environment no longer appeared in our definition of sustainability. And of course, it also turned around the whole discourse away from limits to growth towards reconciling growth with environmental concern. And so that, I'm sure most of us know that, but at the time, to me, that was a complete wake-up moment. And until I had that wake-up moment, I would have been completely in favor of sustainable development. And I may have transparently and consciously put forward an agenda and my contributions to a democratic process on that basis, because I just didn't have that awareness yet, or that understanding of the wider context and the backstory. And so what that aligns with, or now as a political theorist, the context I can put that in is that power really operates at its most powerful when it becomes a common sense. Okay, when people are not even aware of being under the influence of some form of power or manipulation, in the sense of a restricted frame through which we see the world. And unbeknownst to us, we see the world in a restricted way. And so if we understand that as one dimension of power that is really difficult to get to, that implies it's really difficult for someone to just be conscious of where they're coming from and why they're coming from that, because precisely making that difficult is the way that power works best at.
Great. Thank you, Marit. And what you're saying there makes me think about the role of assemblies of all kinds in shifting the Overton window. So what was previously unthinkable or radical becomes sensible and available, and how they could be part of that sort of mulching process.
And I think also the fact that the more diverse an assembly is, and the more passionate and genuine and from all walks of life people are, the more likely is it that there's going to be some wake-up moments like that, or like a shift in perspective that people weren't expecting.
Great, thank you. And now I look at your name and I worry that I'm going to mispronounce it. So Miguel, is that how you say it?
Michael.
Michael, I'm sorry, Mike.
It's that's fine. Everyone does Miguel normally, but it's actually it's Cornish for Michael.
Okay, so Michael, do you have a story you'd love to share with us?
Yeah, I've got a story I'd like to share with you. First of all, I'd just like to agree with a couple of the speakers already, especially about the idea of unfortunately, low-income families not being engaged in climate change issues because they're so busy engaged in the problems in everyday life. And that is a real issue for us in Cornwall. We're one of Britain's poorest regions. But I think the biggest thing is that we have to know our audience. Mm-hmm. And when you know your audience, you can tailor what you say to that audience in the language we use, because what I often find in climate movements, the language they use is very, so to say, middle class or academic, and it doesn't resonate with ordinary people. So that for me is a very important point. We have to have accessible language which is accessible for everyone to understand. If you ask the ordinary man and woman on the street, what does carbon neutral mean? 1.5, 2 degrees zero. They would have no idea of what we're talking about. So, getting our language right, first and foremost, scientists especially. I work with some scientists. My background is in the social science, I have to say. But I just like to tell you our story we've had in Cornwall. Mm-hmm. And what we've had in Cornwall is we've had occupations. So we occupied, first of all, Cornwall County Hall. That is the seat of power in Cornwall. And we occupied the building, and we had a big demonstration outside. And we went into the building and we had our first People's Assembly in that particular building. Who sets the agenda? We set the agenda, the people. I'm speaking now as a climate activist. I do not trust governments anymore or state agencies to set an agenda, because all I see that governments and state agencies do is they market. They're involved in marketing of hope. They're very detached from the real world of what's really happening in the climate crisis and what science is saying. They're so focused on economic growth, and when we all know we need degrowth. But I just want to tell you a Cornwall story about the one in which we occupied the buildings. So we occupied Cornwall County Hall. We had a People's Assembly on a question which we'd pre-planned. So on that particular day of occupation, we pre-planned everything. Who sets the agenda? We had a team who set the agenda specifically especially for Cornwall. Who did we invite? We invited various coalition groups. We invited housing groups. We invited farming communities. We invited activists. We invited local councillors. And yeah, what happened in the end, the police came and they asked us to leave. So we said, no, we're staying here. Yeah. And we stayed here, and we had our People's Assembly. And in Cornwall, the councillors meet every 2 months. And from then on, what we did, we occupied that building every 2 months, and we had a People's Assembly on different issues. The cost of living, housing, all that was included, especially the climate crisis. So, and what we've been managed to do, so the People's Assembly we had in the County Hall, we now have a four-person team who meet the leaders of the council every 2 months. So we have our People's Assembly, and we collate all the data from that. We pass that on then to our team who meet the council leaders, and they hopefully listen to us. And we've had reactions for this. For example, Cornwall recently had a citizens' assembly on the decarbonisation of the energy structure in Cornwall. We advocated for that. We advocated also for what we call a climate commission. We advocated for that, and now that's been instigated. We also advocated for Cornwall to accept the Climate and Nature Bill. We advocated for that. It's been put into action. So, there is some kind of transparency there. And when we occupied the cathedral, we went into not the cathedral, the council. We also occupied in the summer for 2 weeks solid the county council grounds. And we gave talks and trainings to the public every day. We then went in and occupied the cathedral in Cornwall, and we asked if we need to talk to you and explain to you about what the seriousness of the crisis, but bring it in within a cost of living context, housing context, and all that. So the cathedral, so we hosted it in there. And the thing about it now, what we've developed in Cornwall very quickly, is that often the cost of the facilities which we have are very expensive here in Cornwall. So, sometimes for a hall, you're paying £300. So what we've got now, the council paid for our People's Assembly in the cathedral. So they paid £400. And we have now an up and coming one about the climate and nature crisis, related to how the climate crisis will affect Cornwall and the families, our work, and our structures of lives. And that's going to be coming up in the 30th of November. And last point, and that's going to be paid for by Falmouth Town Council. So what we're trying to do is get local councils to pay for our People's Assemblies. And we're developing that model.
Wonderful. And I know we've got a series of hands up, and I know at least 2 of those people have news stories, and I want to make sure we get to them. But there is a question in the chat for you from Rich, which is about, just very quickly, how were the different topics selected? So, which of course is part of our question here about who sets the question. You had these occupations, you had these series of citizen assemblies. How were the questions selected from the
Yeah, okay. What we did, like for everything, we had a team. So for every session we had at County Hall, we have a media team, we have actions team, we have a questions team, and we have a team which develops a question for our People's Assembly inside of County Hall. So in County Hall, what we eventually happened in County Hall is that we actually went in with councillors into the main chambers. Yeah. And we had a People's Assembly with the councillors in the Cornish Parliament together. So we had climate activists and councillors coming together. And what we're trying to do now also, we have robust action and dialogue. We call it the dual pathway. Yeah, that's what we call it. We need robust action. We also need dialogue with our civic representatives. And that's what we're trying to do. But we're not afraid to take action. But who developed that question? We did, our groups. So the team, which was tasked with developing the question for the People's Assembly, made the question.
Wonderful. I feel like the story is very inspirational, and I like the idea of the dual pathway. I can absolutely see it in my mind with a capital D and a capital P as well,
Exactly.
to really emphasize it. Thank you so much for all of that, Miguel. I'm
Forget
close.
it, forget it.
I'm not quite there. I'm sorry.
Just call me Mike.
Mike,
Yeah.
there we go. Pete, I know that you've got a new story to share. So what story would you like to tell us?
At the risk of looking like I'm up my own ass, can I show some pictures at the same time so that you don't have to look at my...
As long as they're not pictures of your ass, Pete.
There it goes. Tell me if you can see that.
Yes, we can see.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So I'm aware that we should be talking just for like a couple of minutes, David. So I just want to give you an example of a process that we ran. I'm from Shared Future. We were paid by Preston City Council to run a people's jury on climate change last year. So the agenda, and I think this meets all maybe three of Rich's suggestions of who sets the agenda. So the agenda was set by an advisory group. So the advisory group, classic citizens jury, citizens assembly process, oversight panel, advisory group, they set the agenda, they set the question. And that was, so the advisory group is made up of local authority, public sector, voluntary community sector, including XR, and the private sector. So they came up with this question: how can we in Preston work together to address the opportunities and challenges of climate change in a way that is fair to everyone? And the process was for 30 participants, 8 sessions, 31 hours of people's time. So, but we said to the jury right from the start, what should we focus on in our deliberation? So what should we wanted to give them some of the power about what they should be talking about some of the agenda setting. But we didn't want to just say, so what do you want to talk about? We did a long part of the process was about preparing them for making that decision about what they wanted to talk about. So what we did first was we had a session on what is climate change. So the commentator was selected by the oversight panel, the advisory group, and that was I can't remember his name, but never mind. And then another session was where are the emissions coming from? So we got Mike Berners-Lee there with his pie chart talking about where are the emissions coming from specifically in Preston. And then we said to the group, okay, we're going to explore now, how does change happen? So we got them to do lots of personal reflections on what change can look like individually, in their own experiences, in their own communities, their own neighbourhoods, nationally, globally, in the past and in the present, to get them to think a bit about what change looks like, how it happens, what sustains it, what leads to it, etc. And then we did with the group some introductions to the theories of change without using that language. So we brought in some external people that were able to explore with them what different theories of change look like as so that they're better able to understand before figuring out what it is they're going to talk about, what change can look like. And finally, we did some power mapping. So we did some very practical power mapping activities with the group where we got them to think about who has the power to influence how we address climate change in Preston. So you can see, some of you might be familiar with the power pot exercise there. That's what they've done in small groups on the floor there. They've tried to work out who has the more power to be able to influence how we address climate change in Preston. So finally, after they'd done all that, so that took up like two or so sessions, we said, what should we focus on to them? And this involved lots of small group talk and conversation and an attempt by us to build some consensus with them. And then they identified housing, food and transport as the key topics that they'd like to spend more time investigating. And then the remaining sessions were focused on those topics. I think my time's up, David.
Great, thank you. And you've run out of pictures too. So, but thank you very much for that, Pete. That's a very interesting, what am I trying to say? Not just throwing at people, set the agenda now, but instead giving them a chance to work through and work up to that and making sure that they feel informed as they're making those choices. That's very interesting. Rosa, I know you also have a story for us. What's your story?
Yeah, well, first I want to say that was a awesome example, Pete. It was a lovely, very thorough process. Really enjoyed hearing about it. I have two micro stories. These are not very huge, especially the first one. The context was a two-part workshop. I was teaching a facilitation workshop where the organizer, this was in North Carolina in the US, also wanted people who already were more skilled at facilitation to be learning about some kind of a mini citizens council. And so she had a group of people who were doing Democrat-Republican dialogue across difference. Believe it or not, we actually have a lot of that in the United States, even though you might not know that from the recent election results. And so she invited this group of people if they wanted to come and be a facilitated assembly so that the people who were in the facilitation advanced training would observe and then ask questions afterward. And so Ruth, the organizer of this, had thought that a good topic would be, what kind of an environment do we want for our children? Thinking climate, thinking, that this would be a topic that would bridge across differences. And what happened is that it was like a evening and then next morning, so it was relatively short. At the close of the evening, one of the participants kind of tentatively said, do we, it was, I don't remember exactly how she said it, but it was basically like, do we have to talk about this question? And I was really curious. And I said, well, this is supposed to be for you. What do you want to be talking about? And she said, well, here we are talking about the environment that we want for our children. And I'm concerned about, what environment does my child face when they leave the house? Are they going to be shot at in the street? Right? So that's the environment that I care about. And so it seemed like the most logical thing to me to say, well, I mean, I checked with Ruth a little bit as well, but yeah, I think we can talk about that. And so the next morning when we started again, we went in a pretty different direction, right? We were talking about the violence in Durham, North Carolina, and violence from the police and danger in the streets and that kind of environment and what can be done about it. And it was, it ended up being a really powerful experience. And the second mini story connects a lot because when I started doing research for my doctoral work on the citizens councils in Vorarlberg, one of the most powerful stories from a facilitator who I interviewed, she was talking about how, I was asking them about memorable moments in working with groups, and she was talking about a citizens council that they had done in a rural area that was looking at what can we do so that we can retain more of our young people in this area instead of having them all leave. And so it was an area that had a lot of reliance on tourism, but they were talking about how really they are about much more than that, and all of this stuff. And then almost 3/4 of the way through the assembly, a participant, young person, raised their hand and said, "We are not talking about the real issue on the table here. There is a huge drug problem in this area, and no one wants to talk about it." And a lot of the people in the assembly itself, the other participants, got very upset and were like, "Oh, no, no, this isn't true," et cetera. And so there was a whole process of taking some deep breaths and saying, "Okay, we will have a chance to hear from everybody here," and continuing to and extending the time frame, right? This was close to the end, and it's like, we're going to stay here, even though it's a little longer than we said, which for Germans is and Austrians is a big thing. Um, and really hear from everyone, and ended up not taking as long as we thought it would, but people really recognized that this was an issue, and there were some recommendations we needed to make about how this issue needed to be addressed, et cetera. So I just want to say that, so this is getting into the facilitator end of things. It's like, I think that the design is very important, and doing all this pre-work is super important. And the more of that you've done, probably the less surprises you will have in store. But still, there's an element of just really being able to be flexible in the moment and listen to people about where they want to go, that I think is also really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. And there's also a continuity with Michael's points around almost like people seizing the agenda, either by occupying the council buildings or by putting their hand up 2/3 of the way through and saying, "Do we want to be talking about this, or is there something else?" So thank you for that, Rosa. Mike, you've been very patiently waiting with your story. And Steve, I noticed that you've put a story into the chat, but I'd love to hear you talk us through it rather than us trying to find it in Google Docs. So I might come to you next, but first we've got Mike. What's your story, Mike?
Right. Well, I come from Hay and Wye. I come out of Extinction Rebellion, and I felt that we needed to do something to show people what an assembly was. And if we went into our communities and actually strategically designed them in order to empower the community to take agency over their futures, that we would be able to get many, many, many more people onto the streets when we needed them. So that's where I began from. But then I started thinking about, well, this is a systems change model. So how do you actually talk about systems change? How do you actually do that? Well, at the moment, the story that we tell ourselves is what's created the mess that we're in. So the story that exists at the moment is we are anonymous consumers in capitalism's all-consuming delirium. The very cause of the climate catastrophe, which, since the endless march of globalization, will end in the complete completion of the 6th major extinction on Earth within 80 to 150 years. And it looks from the science as though that's going to be happening. So therefore, we need a new story. So the story that I wanted to tell my community was that we should decide that we are citizens of our local community, where we have agency over our future, and we will work together to create the future we want with a sense of hope, purpose, and belonging. So the model I came up with, and it was I who came up with it, and then I had to test it to see if anybody's interested in it, was basically to address the 3 issues which seemed to me to be the most important. And before I launched the thing, I spoke to at least 300 people in and around our local community. And there's only, altogether, there's only about 5,000-6,000 people in Hay and its surrounds. And what I said is, what would you think if we were to become self-sufficient in locally grown, agroecologically grown food? Everybody seemed to think that was a good idea. And it wasn't an easy thing, a difficult thing to sell, because we were self-sufficient in the 50s and 60s. So maybe we could go back to where we were, but do it in a rather more friendly way to nature. I also suggested that why don't we have our own community energy company and become self-sufficient in energy? And most people said, right, that's a great idea. Could we actually do this? And I said, well, I have no idea whether we can do this. The question is, do we want to do it? And the thing that was going to hold all this together was mental well-being, because we know as activists that it's very easy to go downhill very quickly if you look at the realities of what appears to be coming our way. So the question there is, how can we support our community, or what can we do in our community to address mental well-being by changing the culture, by changing the language around it, where it's okay not to be okay, where it's possible to bring people into the community and get them to organize themselves together. So this is a survival model. And the only way that we could find out whether it worked or not was to suck it and see. So we launched our first assembly. And the question, and again, we were very deliberately using a question which wasn't consulting everybody about the question, because it was, how might we support ISWE as a community to become self-sufficient in sustainably grown local food, eventually producing enough to feed the town and its environments, much as we did in the 50s and 60s. And that's designed specifically to keep away anybody who is a climate denier. It's denied. The idea is to bring people in who actually want to do this. And we were oversubscribed by 100%. We had 80 delegates, 10 facilitators, and 10 note takers, and a crew, including film and a filmmaker and so on and so forth, of about 9. And we got 180 people wanting to come. Now that's 10% of our community, basically, or certainly of the town. So we kind of knew, right, this seems to be working, and it's taken off. It's taken a long time to get the rest of the powers that be in Wales to understand what we were trying to do. But once they got it, they've got behind us, and there's a possibility of the model now being rolled out across Wales, and we're able to get the grant funding that we need in order to make it happen. And so it's kind of a completely different approach to what everybody else has done, and that's really the story.
And if I hear you right, then the way the question was set was, it was sort of you taking your own initiative, testing it a little bit, and you found a question that resonated with people.
Yeah.
Drew them in. It was an attractor.
Absolutely.
Rather than there was a steering group which deliberated, it was you deliberating with some testing on those 300 people you went to kind of speak with. So as you say, it's quite a different model. I want to make sure we give everyone a chance to tell their stories, and we've got about 10 minutes before I'm going to ask Claire for her themes to start us off on that, making sense on them. And Steve, I promised you that you'd have a chance to not just put your link into the chat, but actually to tell us the story. So what's your story, Steve? What is it that you've shared with us already in that other format?
Sorry, it's not really a story because we haven't had a citizens' assembly yet. I was concerned we were going to run out of time. That's why I posted the link in there. Sure. It's an anticipation of an issue, if you like. I've done a lot of work with community assemblies in Extinction Rebellion locally and in the London region, and I've done the instructions on citizens' assembly, the training course for activists, and given that a few times. But I don't actually know anybody personally who's run a citizens' assembly before. And we've decided, I'm involved with Dirty Water, and Dirty Water has decided it's a campaign in XR originally against pollution of waterways. Mm. And we're proposing that our next objective is a citizens' assembly on water, because our work has taken us into contact with water conservation people, with people who are concerned about just the supply of drinking water, never mind sewage and waste treatment, and obviously the much wider issue of waste in the environment. 40% of water pollution is from agricultural runoff, for instance, which is outside the control of the water companies. So we decided to have a citizens' assembly on water, and we've agreed also that this needs to be a civil society creation, and it's been adopted as campaign strategy. we've started to set out on recruiting allies, organisations, and individual campaigners to join us in this in bringing this about. And of course, the questions are getting tougher. So if we campaign for and won a government-sponsored citizens' assembly on water, I'd be terrified that the politicians wouldn't be able to restrain themselves from interfering, shaping the question and the expert testimonies, ruling what might suit their agenda and ruling out perspectives they'd find uncomfortable. So we agreed, let's make it a civil society affair. But now it's evident that our processes need to be even more squeaky clean than those of any government initiative, in part because we'll have added the politicians and their mainstream media advocates as an audience rather than as participants themselves. So we started off with a suggested question: how do we want our water managed, which was sufficiently broad to address all the aspects that we wanted covered in our campaign. And we've revised it as we've gone, so people have chipped in and we've come up with how might we manage our water in a way that's environmentally sustainable and equitable, which seems a bit better. But we've left our proposal open, and we expect as allies sign up to join us and to participate in this campaign, allies by allies, I mean the other organisations, we expect there'll be a lot of to and fro. And like all good plans, it probably doesn't survive its first contact with your allies anyway. And we want, as they commit to join the campaign, we're anticipating that these things will get the original proposal for the assembly itself, and indeed the question and the agenda will get questioned. So now, when I'm asked a question by people who might join us or people in the public, I'm referring them to the process that we have and saying it's open, and that the ultimate wording of the question would be actually be agreed by the assembly itself when it gathers. Mm-hmm. And that's my view. I don't think we have a. I think the ambition of the assembly is just the breadth of it. So we might end up trimming it because we have to raise money to pay for it, and therefore we might not have the money we want to address every single aspect. But as far as we can, we want that to be our ambition, and we'd like to, I guess. We'd like that to, that to be a subject of debate, and as well as people come in and so on, and that ultimately to be agreed by the assembly itself. So they say that the scope of this is something that they want to take on.
And it sounds like all of this, the pre-work in this, starting with one suggested question, already on to a revised one, it almost gives the assembly a running start on getting to that question that it wants to investigate, particularly if you keep hold of the journey and you got from the start to there. One question I have, Steve, you mentioned we are doing this, we are choosing this. Just I missed, perhaps I was distracted by the chat, but just who is the we?
At the moment, it's the Dirty Water campaign, which is part of Extinction Rebellion primarily. We have a few people from Surfers Against Sewage on board as well.
Cool, great, thank you. Very interesting and similar-ish to Mike in that there's a sort of starting point that tested and built out, and interesting also about your relationship with the powers that be and how you want to work with that. We are almost at 8:10. At 8:10, 8:15 is when I want to move over to Claire and ask her for her themes, and I'm sort of looking to see if she's looking panicky at the idea of me asking her for themes, just to check if she's okay with that. But before we do that, there's a last chance for anyone who's got a story which hasn't been shared yet that they'd like to share. And I'm aware there's folks who haven't spoken yet who are from our practitioners. So if you're a practitioner and you have a story to share which you've not had a chance to share yet, I am calling you and inviting you, and I'm asking you, and I'm leaving a bit of space, but there doesn't seem to be anyone. So, in which case, I feel like I've given everyone the chance there to share one more story. In which case, over to you, Claire, for your reflections, your themes from what you've heard from everybody so far.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's been really interesting to listen to all the stories and reflections. So one of the things that I've written down is that you know, one of the questions I think that comes from this inquiry is where are you getting your legitimacy from? And obviously that's come through from what you're saying, Steve. There's how are you going to stand up to scrutiny when people say, yeah, but you know, you set it up and you're you, or set it up and you knock about with Claire, or when someone sort of says, oh, it's just full of movement people, or when someone just decides to smear one of the organisers in the tabloids. There's all sorts of reasons why this sort of civil society stuff, I think, struggles all the time with its thinking about how to get legitimacy, and how it's, you know, from the previous conversations we've had in this series, actually, one of the things that came up was like, maybe an assembly just is legitimacy if it's effective. And if it's not effective, then it isn't. So you can have a really great process that doesn't make anything change, that's looking at something that has to change. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't matter how good your structure was or your, you know, deliberation about what the question should be or the agenda. It's just, if it doesn't do anything, then it's not going to be a legitimate object in the end. And for me, that sort of really links back to what you said, Mike, about creating agency in order to like benefit collective mental health. And that feels really important from a climate perspective, but also probably from quite a lot of other issues that I think people want assemblies to work for, where there isn't a very vast depth of knowledge across society at large, where you've got a very big problem that probably a lot of people don't think is quite as big as the people who look at it in great detail. And then that becomes about survival somehow, which relates back to the other theme, which was about having an environment, and one person's term of environment for your kids is different to that of somebody who's very worried about their immediate safety when they step outside each day. So shows to me that something I feel like we find all the time, and part of the question that I'm going to ask at another point in this series is to do with marginalized identities and inequalities. But, you know, it does sound like there's a theme here that diversity of people involved will give you opportunities to learn about yourselves and each other, but also that there's an element of inequality in society that makes these sort of things extremely difficult to make them work. Because of course, if it was just a lot of people who are quite the same in a small space with a small scope, it would be much easier to do the work somehow. And maybe that includes consensus decision making about the question or the frame that you're going to set for the thing, because there did seem to be like a sort of a push for bottom up and a push for expertise in this conversation, which might look better when you put it all together in one go. But Pete, when you talked about that process of bringing XR together with the private sector, together with the council, together with whatever, I actually just thought that sounds like hell on earth. Trying to make a decision in a room full of people like that. So maybe I'll talk to you more about that sometime. But I think, you know, the issues around the idea of consensus are quite interesting to me in terms of like what's a good thing to do, because is it good to get consensus or not? And Graham Smith, you know, asked me on a panel the other day, like, why do climate activists think assemblies are such a good idea for climate, when you're going to get, if you go for the consensus, you'll get something not radical. And that obviously isn't what you think you want. So, you know, that might be a frame that you look at on that. And so I've got a question about consensus decision making. One person knows the life or deathness of it and one person doesn't. Or whatever, you know. So I guess there are themes here about process which relate to the deciding what the frame is, which is the same questions you'd ask of like the broader process, if that makes sense, which is a theme that I feel comes up again and again in these conversations. Not only is it sort of who starts and, you know, chicken and egg stuff like that can feel like that, but also it's almost like becomes like a sort of fractal space in terms of when you think about the sort of fabric of these processes. And I think the self-awareness thing you know, the honesty. It's nice to invite honesty and openness and share who's funding you, and then also this sort of dilemma again about self-awareness and the fact that you may have your context set for you by the reality that you swim in, and perhaps if you're not totally aware of that, you try and be honest, but you're not being that honest, which is another sort of dilemma or paradox, isn't it, of our sort of political lives. So what am I saying? Themes. I'm saying I'm saying legitimacy, effectiveness, well-being, diversity, and actually the thing that I've missed off that list, maybe I need 6. I would say self-awareness, but also a lot of people talked about needing to be on the streets, or needing to be like blocking a building, or needing to be just generally building up other forms of collective agency and power, probably through embodied something, something perhaps disruptive, something perhaps taking up space, and that need for that sort of dynamism between the two, which, you know, I don't know that I've seen that many examples of it yet. Michael, yours is really interesting because you've actually carved out the access for yourselves by doing it in that way. And it sounds like that's been possible then to set the agenda with more legitimacy, literally because you did some direct action, which is fascinating, because often people say you won't have any legitimacy if you do direct action. You need to be a sensible person who sets up NGOs or something like that. So that's another paradox which is in these calls. I hope that's helpful, but I don't know, do I pass on to Rich? Do you come back and say some stuff?
If you pass over to me, so I've stuck in the chat that last list that Claire had, which was sort of the keywords of her themes. And I know, well, Rich, I see you've been posting in the chat various connections out to all kinds of background. Are there other themes that you've heard that you want to bring our attention to? Other thoughts and reflections that you've had?
Yeah, thanks. It's really, really rich conversation. I think I'm going to come back to that point about what are we trying to do here. I think it's really, really important. And I can tell you what I'm trying to do here is create new governance systems that enable us to address the poly crisis and build solidarity. That's what I'm trying to do. I don't think that's what everyone on this call is trying to do. I don't think so. Yeah, so for me, it's not about creating new organizing structures to kind of work on this or that, which is perfectly legitimate. But that's just not the bit. So I think it's quite useful for us to be quite clear about what we're ever trying to do, because whatever you're trying to do really affects how you take forward those different activities. So I think we've obviously raised the point around power literacy, and it really hit me hard in this call how I think this power literacy point, expanding power literacy for whether you're in institutions, because whether you're in institutions, because most of the community groups I speak to aren't like the example in Cornwall. They're actually quite the opposite. Like there's a brilliant, I'll just share with you a very quick story I had recently with the council, whereby they were wanting to set up a community-led citizens assembly in this council. Now, there was this large meeting took place. The leader of the council was like a Green Tory. The woman said to me, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get the other Tory councillors to support this. And I said to her, this was back in like February, I said to her, look, if Starmer comes in at the end of the year and he doubles your budget, are you going to have enough money for increasing cost of social care, raising costs of blah, 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 etc. She said, probably not. I said, no, you're not. And these people don't want to do any of that. Like, they don't want to get on with the bins and keep the roads clean. And they're trying to do a whole load of other stuff, which you're probably not going to have capacity for. And so I think there's this whole sense of building everyone's power, kind of politicians' power, civil servants' power, but communities' power, just to kind of get things done in the face of the crisis we're in. And we need new governance structures to do that. That's my sense of that. And I think this point around consensus is critical. I really think it's like 20 years ago, a paper was written called See-Through Science, all about people like me manufacturing consensus on things like GM issues, all this kind of stuff that was big at the time. It was written by Becky Willis and James Wilson, if you know those people. And at that point, we all learn in the movement that actually we need to move away from consensus-based processes to create, we didn't all learn, but some of us did, that we need to create processes which are about creating deep respect and solidarity between people to be able for them to express your position. So you might get a pro-choice or pro-life bit in an abortion conversation. And that's what made the best stuff in the Irish Assembly so powerful, is they didn't necessarily agree, but they got deep respect for the legitimacy of their different perspectives, and the whole environment around it was transformative. And I think Justin was saying something to that effect, I think, in the chat. I mean, for me, that's what's powerful. So I think it's not about consensus. I think it's absolutely, or the version I use around consensus is about creating the conditions for deep respect between people to enable the unexpected transformations to happen. And then it just points about kind of transparency. So we have a funders agreement at ISWE, whereby if you fund any of our work, you can have no influence over anything. That's the deal. That's the deal. We've lost funding because of it, but that's the deal. And I don't know why other people don't do that. Just be braver. Just get them to sign it. Just sign it early, like when they think they really like you. But anyway, there's just some kind of education in the whole kind of system whereby you can get those things in place. I just don't understand quite. And then I just want to say finally this point around, we were talking about concerns around capture. And I remember vividly in 2010 when Gordon Brown led a national energy debate, and lots of my friends were involved with running this national energy debate. And these people who I knew were really, used to be stringent climate activists, all of a sudden ended up running a process which was kind of basically providing permission for a pro-nuclear policy that in the end got taken to court by the Market Research Society for breaching guidance on being independent. And what happened is they'd become captured. They'd become so good friends with the institution that unconsciously they'd become captured and were basically providing the legitimacy for the implementation of things they fundamentally disagreed with. And I guess my point around this is that I don't think, I'm really skeptical of the ability of having of national government, of commissioning these processes. Now, I think we have to lead them and create them ourselves as civil society, but we create an option. Say, look, do you want to provide us your endorsement, Antonio Gutierrez or Starmer? No problem. We've got our conditions here. You can influence nothing, like not a single little thing. But if you want to endorse it as a kind of basis for your decision making to provide you much needed legitimacy, then great, we'd like that. But we don't really want necessarily your, anything from more than that. And I think there's something like that in terms of how we orientate towards institutions whereby we're building all of our power and we're not feeling that we need to be in this permissive relationship.
Well, thank you very much for that, Rich. Janos hasn't spoken yet, but has been slightly busy in the chat. And so I'm intrigued on your reflections and themes, Janos, and then Rosa will come to you. So Janos.
Yeah, I wrote a question that I'm quite interested in, just receiving your perspective. But maybe more generally, I was thinking about, for me, there's not the one right way of agenda setting. I just think that agenda setting entails so many different dimensions and so many different aspects, and you can make so many different choices there as well. And I think they all come, not all of them, but they often come with trade-offs. Also, depending on what your aim is and what your main objective is with the assembly. And I think we have to be aware that there are very different objectives, also depending on the context in which you're running an assembly. So one of the trade-offs that I was interested in now is I see that there is often a trade-off between, setting an agenda or using a framing or choosing sub-questions to address that are more radical, and maybe aiming for more systemic change and systemic reflections, and then impact in the end, maybe on policy, on public policy decisions, or on implementation. So I was wondering what you, whoever wants to answer, think about that. Do you see that trade-off at all? And if so, how do you think you can address it?
That might be the basis for another session rather than something we can necessarily answer in the next 7 minutes, Janos, but I think it's an excellent question. But if we get a chance to, we will. Rosa, you've had your hand up, and also Marit, you were commenting earlier, and I just want to give you a chance to come in with your themes after that. But Rosa, you've been patiently waiting.
Yeah, so maybe this is for another session as well. I think it kind of relates to what Janusz was saying. It seems to me that, well, I think that there's lots of reasons for having assemblies. And I also feel like the reasons are interconnected because there's a potential enormous empowerment of people going through the process or increased agency or however you want to call it. But part of that depends on feeling like all their good work has actually had an impact on the world. So external outcomes then become important from that regard as well. Totally agree with you, Rich, about the importance of creating a climate of respect and that allows for transformation to happen. At the same time, I'm really confused. I need to go back and read a lot more of the literature here, but it seems like sometimes when people are arguing against consensus, they're kind of arguing against a straw man because it's like kind of this idea that everybody's going to agree on everything and that then they're going to be like on the same place for forever and ever. Whereas my experience in practice is that consensus just I'm really wanting to not use that word at all, but just discover areas of common ground, right? So I may disagree with you on a zillion different things, and we've discovered that there is something that we actually both really care about. And the Braver Angels, who's been bringing together Reds and Blues here in the US, they do that a lot with people, right? Like we're not going to change your being a red or being a blue. And yet there are many issues that we can work together on. So I don't know what to call that because the C word has gotten really unfashionable lately, but that's why I'm starting to call it common ground. And then that allows the impact to happen because if you can say to a government, hey, very diverse people here, and we're all on common ground that we want to see movement in this, then people won't feel as much like their time has been wasted. So that's it. Check.
Great, thank you, Rosa. It also makes me remember in the deep democracy method, once you've made a decision, then for those who disagree with the decision, they're asked the question, what would it take for you to come along? And that sort of speaks to Richard's point about if you're building a permanent, ongoing infrastructure, then you have an infinite game or a game with an infinite number of rounds. So you may lose this round in the sense of you don't get the decision you want, but you want to know you'll be treated with respect in subsequent rounds and that you can bring in your thoughts. That's all right. I'm editing too much. Marit, we probably have space for one or two comments. So what would you like to emphasize for us in terms of themes and things you've heard?
Yeah, I'm not thinking I'm so much adding another theme, but I really agree with this point about power literacy that Rich made, which is not a term or a concept I'd framed this in myself previously, but I think it makes a lot of sense. And so I guess I just wanted to give this example of how sometimes, there's always different ways in which we could see the world, different imaginaries. And each of those come with a certain vocabulary as well and certain keywords that may sound completely innocuous, but I think they often do pre-structure and then reinforce how we see the world in a particular way. And that means that sometimes a framing that seems completely fair, innocuous, neutral, intuitive could still use some of those key words that maybe no one is thinking is in any way illegitimate, but that still maybe reinforces a particular way of seeing the world. When sometimes I think the important task of democratic processes is to channel enough critique for us to become aware of alternative ways of seeing the world and then have a discussion about those. And so I think if that's what maybe Rich understands power literacy to be, to me, that would be an important element of power literacy. And to that extent, I would think that maybe we need to be concerned with increasing power literacy across society and not just see assemblies as specific spaces as almost a shortcut around that. I think they depend on a degree of power literacy across society at large to function in a democratizing way.
Cool. Thank you very much. Another vote for power literacy, as it were. A final call for any reflections or themes, particularly anything which is coming to you that you've not heard from anybody else or you've not had a chance to speak before. I think I saw Ava raise her hand. Yes, both the physical hand and then the virtual hand. So
I eventually found the virtual hand. Hang on, I don't want an AI companion, which I also seem to have managed to summon up. I guess, yeah, I've been kind of gradually feeling more and more kind of miserable as I was hearing what felt like more and more of a kind of sense that, oh, you know, we can't agree on basically the matter of our ultimate survival as a species. And I think what I feel hasn't been mentioned and is quite hard to mention, and I guess, you know, in some ways is another opinion, is that so much of our opinions and our worldviews are shaped by quite sort of fundamental conditioning and trauma. And if we can't get into the fact that I am, you know, built up in a certain way with certain rigidities and inability to see certain other points of view because of unconscious patterns, then we won't ever get past that. For me, that kind of understanding about that has been coming in very strongly in the last 10 years around how our early life conditions us to believe and behave in all kinds of ways, and a lot of the antisocial behavior that we see in society, whether it's from the kind of people right at the top who end up in power, that all comes from a kind of traumatic conditioning that we have to be able to talk about. It's like, that's the missing piece. If we can't somehow bring this in, that like our fundamental understanding of how we are as human beings into these conversations, which are becoming absolutely about our survival, then it's like we're kind of sleepwalking into our own demise. And I know that it's really challenging socially to bring up this kind of level of things, because it's also really not socially condoned, and we're supposed to hide the fact that we have inner worlds and be embarrassed about it. But it's like, for me, it's the only thing that can change this. So there you go.
thank you. And I think that adds another layer to one of the points earlier about how we can think about things, cut something, even have to come up with the question, the frames we have comes out of our cultural context. And you're also saying it comes out of our psychological context. And if we're traumatized or struggling from early childhood or for other kinds of reasons, that will affect too. So thank you. We are slightly overrunning. My apologies for that. I want to give Rich a chance to say any last remarks, and then Claire a chance to close us. And then in the past, Josh has had a picture to share, which we might put up just as we finish at 35 minutes past. So Rich, as the question holder on who sets the agenda and how does asking the question set the frame for assemblies, do you have any last thoughts for us as we end our time together?
I just want to support Eva's point, really, and in particular, you know, integration of whether it's like systems thinking theory, you enabling people to go deep down to whatever they can, given the constraints of politics and time and consciousness and facilitation techniques and all those things that are so hard. It does feel to me that that is when these things are most transformative. Just to do a thumbs up to that.
Thank you. And Claire, what would you like to say by way of closing?
Thanks. Well, one that this whole thing about power literacy and also just like consciousness around ourselves, our own biases and limitations, and also trauma, and the perhaps what I think some people would call a very grave lack of political kind of education among the wider society in the UK, which we talked about quite a lot in the Humanity Project, particularly with a decline / downfall of unions and the sort of working class organised spaces, providing political education for people throughout different class parts of the UK class system. It feels like what is coming here is that, aside from talking about how we set an agenda, we're also talking about the fact that to set good agendas, we need a healthy landscape of people that are all thinking, learning together, and thinking critically and deeply about the context that they're working in order to be able to pull together and work to make stuff that's good happen. I could use better words than that if it wasn't 8:30 on the day that Trump got re-elected. I'm quite tired.
Yes, speaking of potentially traumatic events, that's one. Now I can't see Josh, and I don't know whether are you able. So I'm slightly speaking into the dark. Aha!
Look, there he is.
We have a splodge.
Josh is here.
So what we can, if I
is that coming through?
We can see it on the screen, and people can, if they
There you
pin.
go.
So for folks who are on Zoom, if you press there's the thing and press pin, then it'll fill your whole screen, and then you will see Josh's work as, I forget how you describe yourself, Josh. Is it it's more than illustrator, isn't it? It's facilitator, illustrator. I forget the exact.
There's lots of different phrases. I quite like sketch note artist or illustrator.
And so we can absorb your sketch note here and see different aspects of what we've been talking about, all these wonderful colors. I won't ask you to go through it, if only we don't have time, and also it sort of defeats the point to have a picture and ask somebody to talk it through.
Yes, I'd only like to say that I wish I had more time and more space. The conversation's getting really interesting. I may carry on after this talk and work on some of these ideas about power literacy and these psychological inner life missing pieces.
Cool. Wonderful. And I think what we'll try to do as well is, if Josh is able to send to Alex, Claire and myself that picture or the next sketch note, then we'll try to send it out as part of our thank you and next steps email tomorrow or the day after. So, or whenever Alex manages to do that. So it just on me to say thank you very much. Apologies that we've overrun slightly. Thank you for all of your contributions. It was a very rich conversation, lots of different ways in which people were creating the questions they needed for their various kinds of participation, with no one right way, but lots of ways which were making a difference. And it was really inspirational hearing all of your stories. We have a further few of these roundtables on different topics coming up over the next few weeks, and we've got a summary or a bringing together later in the year, and we will be putting out videos and pictures and poems and God knows what else as a way of trying to equip people in lots of different ways to take all of this stuff forward. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, everyone. I really appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And all your hard work.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for facilitating, David.
My pleasure.